Okay, so moving on to the next segment of today's show, I wanted to talk a little bit about the NFC East, mainly because tonight we actually have a pretty big Thursday night football game. And when you look at these two teams' records, it's not really going to stand off the docket at you as a legitimate Thursday night game that many people care about. But at the same time, when you look at the current standings in the NFC East, tonight's game between the New York Giants and the Philadelphia Eagles is very, very important because even though we could all agree all four teams in the NFC East are not very good football teams right now, one of them is going to make the playoffs. And right now, when you look at the NFC East standings, you see the Dallas Cowboys in first place with a record of 2-4. You have the Eagles with a record of 1-4-1 standing there in second. The Giants with a record of 1-5 in third, and the Washington football team is there also with a record of 1-5. So really, any of those four teams, I believe right now, has a legitimate shot of making the playoffs. And we all agree, yes, the NFC East is not very good right now. And I think a lot of people are going to ask the question of, should any team get in? And that's the first thing I'll say. I'm proposing to Roger Goodell and the NFL that they make a rule that if you finish below 8-8, not at 8-8, I think if you finish 8-8 and you win a weak division, okay, maybe you should have a chance to get to the playoffs. But I think there should be a rule in the NFL that if you win your division with a record under 500, so 7-9 or worse, I think that means you should be disqualified from the playoffs entirely. Because I just don't think it's fair to some of the other teams in the NFL, like the Rams or the Cardinals, that play in a really tough division that really may end up missing the playoffs just because one of these not very good teams in the NFC East ends up stealing their spots. So I think there's a legitimate argument to be talking about should any NFC East team get in anyway. But unfortunately, it's not like we could do anything with the rule change right now for this year. It is known that one of these four NFC East teams will be getting into the tournament. So the question is now, which NFC East team is the best? And right now, if you guys were to predict one of these teams to win the NFC East, who would it be and why? And I think for me, I would still say the Philadelphia Eagles are the quote-unquote best team in the division right now, just because Carson Wentz, in the last couple games, he has looked a little better. I understand he hasn't been perfect, and I understand that there are still just a bunch of Philadelphia Eagle fans who are out there crushing him. But at the same time, he's just a tough football player. And I remember speaking about this on this podcast last week, a couple weeks ago, when Carson Wentz led the Philadelphia Eagles into San Francisco and ended up getting the victory when the Eagles were about a touchdown underdog in that game. Somehow, some way, the Baltimore Ravens on Sunday were up 24-6, and the Philadelphia Eagles found a way to at least come back in that game and were really 1-2-point conversion away from tying it up and sending the game to overtime. You also look at the current injury status of this Philadelphia Eagle team. It was announced this week that Miles Sanders, their star running back and really their most dynamic offensive playmaker, and Zach Ertz, the starting tight end, who really hasn't even been great this season, but he's a locker room presence. He's a guy that if you're a Philadelphia Eagle fan, you're always going to want him out there. He is not going to play in tonight's game against the New York Giants. So I'd still say right now the Eagles are the best team in the division just because Wentz has looked a little better as of late. And the other thing about Philadelphia is, and I've kind of briefly pointed to it a couple minutes ago, they have already played a bunch of their hardest games, like going to San Francisco, like hosting Baltimore, like going to Pittsburgh. So luckily for them, they're going to be able to get those games out of the way. If you look at Philadelphia's schedule, they still have the Washington football team at home one game, and that's, for me, a game they really have to win when you consider the fact that they already lost to the Washington football team once this season. They have the Giants twice, and if you remember last year, Philadelphia was kind of in a little bit of a similar situation than they are now because really their whole team was hurt. And I remember they had a home Monday Night Football game last year against the New York Giants in which they were barely able to find a way to win. So Philadelphia right now, super banged up. It's going to be very fascinating for me to see what they do tonight on Thursday Night Football against the New York Giants. And I'll talk a little bit about the Giants briefly. This is probably one of their biggest games as a franchise in a pretty long time. I think when we think about the New York Giants of the last couple of years, really since 2000, the first thing that come to mind obviously are the two Super Bowl championships. But really, within the last 5-6 years, the New York Giants have not been a very good football team. And it's so weird because historically they have been one of the better and well-run organizations in sports. And unfortunately for Giant fans, over the last 5-6 years, really since they beat the New England Patriots in the Super Bowl, they haven't been able to get the job done. And it's not like they're going to be able to, do anything really big this year. But Joe Judge, at least his team has showed some signs. Now, I know the wins aren't there. If you're a New York Giant fan and you see the record at 1-4, that is not something you're going to be particularly happy about. But I do think when you look at the way everything has gone for this New York Giant franchise over the past couple of years, it is refreshing to see a big game tonight against the Philadelphia Eagles. And I know it's only in late October. We still have about 2 months until we crown the division champs around the National Football League. But at the same time, what I'll say is this: the New York Giants do have a shot to make the playoffs. They have a legitimate shot to make the playoffs. And no matter how good this team is, no matter how good or bad this division is, if you're a Giant fan, and I could have told you that a couple weeks ago, you would have definitely signed up for it. Now, in terms of tonight's game, I do think the New York Giants defense has actually been playing some really good football as of late. The two linebackers that they decided to bring in from the Green Bay Packers, Blake Martinez and Kyler Fackrell, have both been really good for this team. Both were big in the win on Sunday against Washington. And the Giants' defense has been playing much better. Now, unfortunately, the problem is, if you're a Giant fan, the offense. Daniel Jones, I'll admit, this is a guy I really liked going into the season. I really liked what he was able to do last year. But unfortunately, so far this year, he hasn't really been able to take that next step. And I'm not, solely blaming him. A lot of that could have to do with the offensive line. A lot of that could have to do with just the overall lack of playmakers around him. But at the same time, even without Saquon Barkley, this New York Giant offense does have Daniel Jones at quarterback. They do have some playmakers at receiver with Golden Tate and Darius Slayton and Sterling Shepard. We'll see if he's able to go tonight. Evan Ingram as well. The Giants' offensive line hasn't been great, including the young kid that they drafted in the first round, Andrew Thomas. He obviously hasn't lived up to hype yet. But at the same time, I do think when you look at this New York Giant team, they do have a real opportunity to come through tonight against the Philadelphia Eagles, and really behind their defense. And Joe Judge, I don't think he's a guy that right now you could judge as a head coach because it's his first year, and it's in the season of the pandemic and the coronavirus. It's tough to judge a coach by record, and when you look at the New York Giants sitting at 1-5 right now, they haven't been that encouraging or really have shown anything to stand out. But at the same time, the signs are there, and I do think they could actually really change their season around and kind of the vibe of the current franchise around with a win tonight. If the Giants could somehow, some way pull out a win tonight, it will probably be their team's most important victory, really since that boat game when they made the playoffs at Lambeau a couple years ago. A couple people have asked me about the Dallas Cowboys and what I think of them right now, and the bottom line is this: they are so bad. So bad. Their effort against the Arizona Cardinals on Monday night was absolutely atrocious. They are already taking shots at Mike McCarthy behind closed doors, as per the Jane Slater report, and she put out that anonymous, Cowboys players are saying that coaches aren't doing their job well enough, which may be true, but at the same time, it's not like the players are on that team are doing their job anyway. They are really showing just no effort whatsoever. And I think that's ultimately a problem with this Dallas Cowboy team. I think every week we could look at this Dallas Cowboy defense on paper and see DeMarcus Lawrence, Jalen Smith, Leighton Vander Esch is back, and say, all right, we know this isn't really a strength to this team, but they should be like middle of the pack, average at worst. No. This defense continues to be one of the worst defenses in the league, and I still don't know how Mike Nolan hasn't been fired yet. I know him and Mike McCarthy go back a long way, going back to their San Francisco days. Mike Nolan was really the one who brought Mike McCarthy into the league, but I think we're seeing right now, right? We talk a lot about, who won the divorce between Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. Well, let me ask you guys this. Who has won the divorce so far between Aaron Rodgers and Mike McCarthy? It's not even close. It really isn't. Aaron Rodgers has won that divorce by a mile, and I think Mike McCarthy's true colors are really showing right now in Dallas, because that team is just an absolute mess. And when you consider the fact that I just gave you some of the names on their defense obviously isn't a strength, but it should be better. Dallas's offense, even without Dak Prescott, should be better as well. And I totally understand that their offensive line is super banged up right now, especially when you consider it to some of the past offensive lines that these Dallas Cowboys teams have had, right? The fact that Tyron Smith and the fact that Lyle Collins are out for the season, the fact that Travis Frederick retired, those are moves that kill you if you're a team like the Dallas Cowboys. And even without that offensive line, I still think they need Zeke Elliott to prove that he's a legitimate playmaker and prove that the money that they're paying him is really worth it. Because right now, on Monday night, when you watch that Dallas Cowboy team, they really didn't have enough playmakers at all. Amari Cooper couldn't even get going, and it's going to be very fascinating for me to see what the Dallas Cowboys do going forward, because Andy Dalton, it's not like he played bad on Monday Night Football, right? It's not like he was the reason why the Dallas Cowboys ended up losing that game to the Arizona Cardinals. It was just the fact that their defense wasn't good, and even though Andy Dalton put up numbers, the turnovers just bit them in too early. If you're Ezekiel Elliott, I mean, look, you cannot be fumbling the ball 2 times in the first quarter in that spot against the Arizona Cardinals. You just needed the game too much. And once again, even without Dak Prescott, the Cowboys are paying Ezekiel Elliott a lot of money. And really, ever since he's got paid, he just hasn't looked like the same player to me. I remember saying going into the season, if you play fantasy, there are a lot of better running backs I'd have over Zeke, like a Derrick Henry, like a Dalvin Cook, like a Christian McCaffrey, like a Saquon Barkley. And I do think that is coming to fruition. Right now, this Dallas Cowboy team is a mess, and the NFC East is wide open. I do think eventually whoever wins this division is probably going to come down to the head-to-head matchups. Philly and Dallas have not played yet. We'll obviously see what the Eagles and the Giants do tonight. And I'm fascinated by the game tonight because I feel like Philadelphia should win, but there are signs that do point to a possible Giant win. The Giants, I feel like, just haven't been good at all against the Eagles over the last couple of years, and once again, this is a game they really need to have. So if I'm a New York Giant fan, even though my team isn't very good, safe to say I'm more excited about tonight's game than many others in the last couple of years.